The year is 1205. The Mongol Empire has already stretched its steel tentacles across Asia, swallowing ancient kingdoms whole and erasing centuries-old borders. But inside the headquarters of the world conqueror, an order rings out that shatters the usual logic of nomadic expansion. Genghis Khan summons Subutai, the very same invincible strategist who would later reduce the Russian principalities to ashes and make the chivalric kingdoms of Europe tremble. But right now, this brilliant commander is being handed a task that borders on absolute madness. The Khan demands the forging of heavy iron chariots, vehicles capable of smashing through dense forest thickets and navigating rocky mountain gorges. He is sending Subutai to the edge of the world, thousands of kilometers away from home, for the sole purpose of hunting down just a few exhausted men, the sons of a Merkit chieftain. The ruler's words do not sound like a dry military directive, they sound like a mystical curse. Even if they turn into fishes and dive to the bottom of the ocean, become the net. Even if they become marmots and burrow deep into the earth, become the digging iron. Get them. Consider the sheer scale of this historical paradox. The Mongol machine of death had always been famous for its terrifying, cold-blooded pragmatism. Genghis Khan knew exactly how to forgive yesterday's enemies, transforming them into fiercely loyal brothers-in-arms. Take the ferocious Jebe, for example, who once cold-bloodedly shot an arrow into the future emperor's warhorse. Instead of an execution, he was rewarded with a seat at the right hand of the throne. Subjugated princes were granted their lives, and talented captives were given high-ranking administrative posts. However, for one specific tribe, the Merkits, there were zero exceptions. They were exterminated down to the very last seed, methodically and ruthlessly, their very name systematically erased from the memory of the Great Steppe. Why did this cold-blooded ruler, a man who thought in the grand scale of conquered continents and global trade routes, harbor such a manic, obsessive hatred for a forest-dwelling people over the span of 30 years? What terrifying secret did the chieftain of this tribe take to his grave, a secret so profound it forced the master of half the world to rewrite his own biography? His name was Tokhto'a-Beki, the chieftain of the forest-dwelling Merkit tribe, the man who became Genghis Khan's personal demon. We are accustomed to viewing the world conqueror as a bronze idol, a ruthless and triumphant victor, surrounded by an impenetrable wall of fiercely loyal generals. But the true history of this vendetta reveals entirely different motives. Before you, the chronicle of the longest and bloodiest rivalry of the 11th century will unfold. You will see exactly how a forest prince outplayed a terrifying army for decades, turning raw geography into his ultimate weapon. You will discover the terrifying extremes a cornered chieftain will go to when not just his own life, but the very existence of his people is on the line. And most importantly, we will expose the true reason behind that insane, relentless pursuit on iron chariots. We will touch upon the dark secret that Genghis Khan desperately tried to bury in the dirt along with the Merkits, a secret that, piercing through time itself, would ultimately strike a devastating blow to his own dynasty. This is a story about how absolute power never forgives those who once bore witness to its weakness. It is a tale of how personal shame, hidden behind the impenetrable armor of authority, becomes the driving engine of genocide. Cast aside the romanticized myths of noble conquerors. Welcome to an era where pure, unadulterated hatred redrew the borders of continents. Every great hatred has its starting point. To truly understand why the Mongol army wiped the Merkits off the face of the earth with such manic, calculating method, we have to rewind the clock 2 decades back, to an era before Temujin was even brought into the world. Steppe politics in the 12th century did not forgive weakness, and the memory of the nomads proved to be far longer than the curved blades of their sabers. This story begins with a theft. Yesuge Bagatur, the father of the future Genghis Khan, encounters a solitary wagon out on the open steppe. Sitting inside is Hoelun, a stunningly young beauty being escorted to his tent by her new husband, the Merkit warrior Chiledu. Blinded by her beauty, Yesuge doesn't hesitate for a second. He and his brothers immediately give chase. Realizing that death is absolutely inevitable, Hoelun commits an act that would serve as the prologue to a continental slaughter. She forces her husband to flee, saving his life. According to ancient legend, the woman takes off her shirt and throws it to Chiledu with the words, "Smell my scent and remember me." Yesuge celebrates his victory. To him, it seems he has simply stolen someone else's bride, a standard display of his clan's dominance and strength. In reality, he had just planted a ticking time bomb directly beneath his own family. The brutal irony of fate was that this exact stolen woman would give birth to the man who would exterminate the entire nation of her kidnappers. But before that could happen, the Merkits would come dangerously close to destroying him first. Years pass. Yesuge has long since been poisoned by the Tatars. His family has been cast down to the absolute rock bottom of the steppe hierarchy. Temujin, having miraculously survived against all conceivable odds, is just beginning to raise his head again. He takes the beautiful Borte as his wife, desperately trying to restore the shattered status of his lineage. But in the dark forests at the headwaters of the Selinga River, the Merkits have forgotten absolutely nothing. The brother of that very same Chiledu, the powerful chieftain Tokhto'a-Beki, had been carefully nursing a plan for revenge for 20 long years. He wasn't planning to simply kill the son of his enemy. Tokhto'a thirsted for a perfectly symmetrical retribution. An eye for an eye, a wife for a wife. It is the dead of night in the year 1180. The piercing silence of the valley is torn apart by a low, rumbling hum. The ground itself begins to tremble. Tokhto'a-Beki, having allied himself with the chieftains Dair Usen and Katai Darmala, launches 300 elite cavalrymen into a full-scale attack. For Temujin's impoverished ragtag camp, 300 warriors clad in hardened leather and iron is an unstoppable death sentence. Hearing the thunderous drumming of hooves, the future world conqueror makes a split-second decision that official imperial chroniclers would later try their hardest to smooth over and justify. Gripped by sheer terror, Temujin leaps onto his horse and flees into the impenetrable, tangled thickets of Mount Burkhan Haldun. He saves his own skin, leaving behind the most valuable thing in his ravaged camp, his young bride, Borte. Absolute chaos reigns in the camp. An old servant woman named Hoakchin makes a desperate, frantic attempt to save her mistress. She hides Borte inside a covered wooden cart, packing it to the brim with black sheep's wool, and drives the wagon away in a blind panic. But fate is utterly merciless. Hitting a deep rut in the earth, the cart's wooden axle violently snaps. The pursuing Merkit riders overtake the broken-down wagon, rip the doors off their hinges, and drag the future Empress of Eurasia out from under the piles of wool. For Tokhto'a-Beki, this is a moment of absolute, unadulterated triumph. He hasn't just avenged his brother, he has completely trampled the honor and dignity of the Borjigin clan. The captive Borte is dragged away to the forest camps and handed over as a concubine to Chilgerboko, the younger brother of the wronged Chiledu. The Merkit chieftain's grand design was perfectly in its psychological cruelty. Let the son of the thief watch helplessly as his own bloodline drowns in inescapable shame. Was this an act of cowardice on Temujin's part? From the perspective of European chivalric morality, undoubtedly, but in the harsh, unforgiving reality of the Great Steppe, a completely different, ice-cold pragmatism of survival dictated the rules. Had Temujin stayed in the camp, he would have been slaughtered in a matter of seconds, and with him, any flickering hope for vengeance would have been extinguished forever. By hiding in the treacherous swamps and dense thickets of Burkhan Haldun, a place where even a well-fed snake could not slither through, he preserved the single greatest weapon capable of altering the course of human history. The single greatest weapon capable of altering the course of human history, himself. However, the psychological toll of this decision proved to be astronomical. Borte is forced to share a bed with her enemy. Temujin is left gnawing on bitter roots in the freezing mountains, listening as the wind carries the mocking laughter of the Merkit warriors. Tokhto'a-Beki celebrates his grand victory, genuinely believing that he has permanently erased his rival's name from the destiny of the Great Steppe. He rejoices, blissfully unaware of the most crucial fact of all. The humiliation did not break the young outcast. It forged him into a monster who would eventually burn this entire forest to the ground. Temujin found himself in a devastating dead end. He has no army, no allies, not even a yurt to call his own. But to get his wife back and wash away this crippling dishonor, he urgently needed a military machine that could overpower the formidable forces of Tokhto'a-Beki. Realizing this grim truth, the fugitive pulls out his only one trump card, a magnificent black sable pelisse, his wife's wedding pelisse. And with these priceless furs in hand, he sets off to purchase an alliance. Tokhto'a-Beki sleeps soundly in his forest domain. He is utterly confident in his own invulnerability. He does not yet know that for the price of his head, the most terrifying military coalition of the 12th century is already quietly forming out on the open steppe. Temujin hid in the tiger bogs of Mount Burkhan Haldun, intently listening to the distant echoes of another man's triumph. Left without a wife, without an army, and seemingly without a shred of hope, the young man found himself at the absolute bottom of the steppe's brutal hierarchy. Tokhto'a-Beki, celebrating his grand victory in the Merkit hunting grounds, sincerely believed that he had permanently broken the spine of the young Borgigan, reducing him to nothing more than a starving forest vagabond. However, the Merkit chieftain had made a catastrophic miscalculation. It was precisely this extreme destitution that forced the cornered fugitive to execute an unprecedented political masterstroke. Temujin produced his one and only treasure, the black sable coat received as a dowry for the stolen Borte. With these rare furs, he didn't set out to hire a band of random cheap cutthroats. He went to purchase an ironclad alliance with the most powerful overlords in Asia, the Kurate ruler Wang Khan and his own blood brother Jamukha. The captive bride's wedding gift was instantly transformed into the hard currency that would pay for the annihilation of her kidnappers. A few months later, 40,000 cavalrymen, clad in hardened leather and iron, silently crossed the nocturnal steppe. Just think about that staggering number for a moment. 40,000 combat-ready soldiers was roughly the population of major European capitals at the time, like London or Paris. This entire colossal mass of men and horses moved with one singular unified purpose: to wipe the Merkit encampment off the face of the earth. The heavy cavalry smashed through the outer barricades, crushing yurts and sowing absolute chaos. The blazing flames of campfires tore through the pitch-black darkness. The terrified shrieks of horses blended with the deafening clash of steel blades and the panicked screams of waking enemies. In the very center of this blazing inferno, a scene played out that would instantly pass into legend. Temujin was not directing this battle from the safety of a distant hill. Steering his warhorse directly through the roaring flames and collapsing wagons, he frantically screamed only one word into the night: Borte. Amid the panicking, screaming crowd, deafened by the relentless clatter of metal, a young woman recognized that familiar voice. Leaping down from a wagon, Borte threw herself directly into the path of the galloping rider and grabbed his reins with a death grip. Husband and wife were reunited in the very beating heart of a bloody massacre. And what of Tokhto'a-Beki? Rudely awakened by the deafening roar of the attack, the chieftain instantly understood the grim reality. The camp was lost, and his people were being butchered. Any other steppe prince, blinded by toxic pride, would have immediately charged into a suicidal counterattack to die a hero's death alongside his men. But Tokhto'a thought differently. Possessing the razor-sharp survival instincts of a hunted wolf, he made a cold, strictly pragmatic choice. Grabbing his sons and a tiny handful of his most loyal elite guards, the chieftain sprinted toward the Selenga River. Hastily lashing together makeshift rafts out of willow branches, the fugitives vanished into the dark, freezing waters, slipping into the deep Barguzan taiga. He had fed his own people to the wolves in order to preserve his ultimate weapon for future vengeance, his own life. Let's look at the aftermath of this fateful night. Temujin had secured a triumphant victory. The coalition worked flawlessly, his wife was rescued, and his authority was fully restored. However, the glowing triumph was heavily darkened by a bitter, unspeakable truth. Borte returned, heavily pregnant. In due time, she gave birth to a boy who was named Jochi, which translates directly to the guest. 9 months of captivity is a microscopic blip in the grand scheme of eternity, but this specific time frame morphed into an unhealing, festering wound for the ruling house. Temujin publicly recognized him as his firstborn, strictly forbidding anyone to ever question his true parentage. But the poisonous whispers of the Merkit bastard had already begun slithering through the camps, deeply poisoning the minds of his brothers and top generals. Tokhto'a-Beki had lost the battle, but he had successfully left a living wound at the very core of the Borjigan dynasty. That very same dark stain would, decades later, nearly rip the entire Mongol Empire apart. It seemed that ultimate justice had prevailed, and the enemy was utterly vanquished. Trampled into the dirt, stripped of his army and his immense wealth, the Merkit chieftain would have simply rotted away in the bogs if he had adhered to normal human logic. But the survivor hiding in the dense forests, Tokhto'a-Beki, had absolutely no intention of surrendering. Deprived of a straight sword, he transformed himself into a poisoned dagger. In the impenetrable depths of the taiga, a union of the outcasts began to quietly form, gathering everyone who despised the rapidly rising power of Temujin, including his former blood brother, Jamuja. The Phantom of the Forest was preparing a devastating strike, a strike that would force the invincible cavalry of the nomads to choke in their own blood. In the Great Steppe, a defeated chieftain usually chose one of two paths: a deeply shameful capitulation or a highly ritualized death in combat. Having lost his grazing lands, his people, and his treasury, Tokhto'a-Beki was supposed to simply dissolve into the background pages of the chronicles forever, becoming nothing more than a faceless shadow in another man's story of triumph. But the Merkit chieftain, driven deep into the harsh Barguzin taiga, completely shattered the 1,000-year-old rules of the nomadic game. Refusing to accept defeat, he weaponized geography itself. Impassable swamps, taiga thickets locked in ancient permafrost, and treacherous river rapids became his brand new army. Mongol horsemen, perfectly accustomed to lightning-fast maneuvers across a limitless horizon, found themselves bogging down in freezing mud up to their horses' bellies. Their long lances became hopelessly tangled in dense branches, while an invisible enemy delivered lethal surgical strikes from the underbrush before instantly evaporating back into the gloom. Surviving in the Siberian taiga during winter without massive herds or warm yurts is a task comparable to surviving on an uninhabited alien planet. But Tokhto'a-Beki wasn't merely surviving. He unleashed the very first systematic guerrilla war in medieval Asian history. Temujin sincerely believed that completely obliterating the enemy's camp guaranteed him absolute safety. The future world conqueror was busy building a new, highly centralized state, fully expecting to meet conventional, regular armies on an open battlefield. In stark reality, he found himself colliding with flying squads of vengeful phantoms who had absolutely no desire to line up in classical, orderly formations. The sinister irony of it all was that the fugitive who had spent years hiding in the forests from his pursuers was now the one dictating the rules of engagement to the rapidly rising lords of the steppe. The psychological pressure mounted with every passing day. Under the cover of darkness, Merkit scouts silently penetrated the very borders of the Mongol encampments, expertly slipping past armed patrols. When morning broke, the guards would find arrows buried deep into the wooden pillars of the Khan's own tents, carrying carved, threatening messages. One ancient legend preserved the chilling text of one such message. "The black raven does not feed on swans. You stole the power, but the forest will take it back." Every single one of these arrows, dripping with the venom of hatred, wounded Temujin's immense pride far more effectively than an actual blade, publicly highlighting the glaring vulnerabilities of his elite personal guard. Realizing that isolated forest ambushes alone couldn't win a prolonged war of attrition, Tokhto'a-Beki began actively forging a massive alliance. Thus, the Union of the Outcasts was born. The fiercely proud forest prince forced himself to extend an open hand to Temujin's sworn enemy, his former blood brother, Jamuka, and also secured the heavy backing of the mighty Naiman Empire. Disconnected bands of vengeful fighters suddenly coalesced into a massive unified front, backed by the regular, well-equipped armies of neighboring superpowers. The smoldering sparks of resentment merged into a towering wall of fire, aimed squarely at the destruction of a single man. It is the spring of 1203, the Khalkhaljid Sands. While Tokhto'a-Beki waged his psychological forest war and sowed widespread discord, Temujin was dealt a catastrophic stab in the back by his own allies. The powerful Karites, led by Wang Khan, betrayed him, attacking at the absolute most vulnerable moment possible, during a grueling march and a difficult river crossing. Beyond the horizon, the ultimate fate of Central Asia was being decided. But here, blinded by massive dust storms kicked up by tens of thousands of hooves, the steppe was suffocating. The Mongol flanks were entirely broken, and the supply wagons were up in flames. Yesterday's trusted allies proved that they were absolute masters of the sudden strike, driving the Mongol leader directly into a lethal trap. In the absolute dead center of this chaotic maelstrom, the Mongol army, which was already widely considered an invincible, flawless machine, shuddered violently and began to fall back. Temujin's third son, the 17-year-old Ogedei, tumbled violently from his horse. An enemy arrow had pierced clean through his jugular vein. Thick blood sprayed onto the dry sand, instantly threatening to cut short the life of the future emperor of Eurasia. Only the phenomenal, lightning-fast reaction of the royal guardsman Borte, who, while still galloping and choking in thick dust, desperately sucked the clotting blood directly out of the prince's neck wound, saved the Golden family from an irreplaceable, devastating loss. Temujin, watching in sheer horror as his absolute best Urut and Mangud regiments were slaughtered, was forcibly compelled to sound the retreat. The Lord of the Steppe ran for his life, leaving a trail of blazing supply carts and thousands of hacked-apart bodies of his most loyal retainers. For Tokhto'a-Beki, still lurking in the deep forests, this crimson sunset was the absolute greatest news he had heard in years. The exiled outcast who had lost his wives, his children, and his homeland, intoxicatingly reveled in the devastating blow delivered by the hands of others. The myth of Temujin's godlike invulnerability had been trampled into the dust, and the Merkit chieftain immediately began rallying his remaining forces to finish off the bleeding, wounded enemy. However, the monumental triumph at the Khalkhalgid sands severely intoxicated Temujin's enemies, entirely stripping them of their most vital survival instinct: caution. The opposition leaders genuinely believed they were now untouchable. Busy celebrating the epic fall of the tyrant, they catastrophically forgot the most basic, fundamental law of wilderness survival. You never ever leave a wounded wolf alive. While the rebellious Khans drank and celebrated the tyrant's downfall, and the Merkits eagerly tasted their final revenge, Temujin, far away from prying eyes, was tightly coiling the spring of his wrath, quietly gathering his surviving, battle-hardened veterans. A massive, decisive confrontation at Mount Nahu was rapidly approaching, a battle that would permanently redraw the borders of the entire continent. But exactly how do you break a coalition that outnumbers you 2-to-1? And exactly which ravenous attack dogs would the future Genghis Khan unleash from their chains to turn Tokhto'a-Beki's glorious triumph into a brutal death agony? It is the spring of 1204. The great steppe holds its breath in anticipation of the most massive, apocalyptic clash of the era. Having decisively routed Temujin at the Khalkhalgid sands, Tokhto'a-Beki did not waste a single second. He swiftly marched his surviving detachments straight beneath the banners of the Naiman Khanate, a colossal Western superpower that possessed a highly organized regular army and an abundance of iron weaponry. The Naimans looked down on Temujin with the sneering contempt of ancient, entrenched aristocracy. Their ruler, the domineering Queen Gurbesu, publicly and loudly declared that the Mongols carried an unbearable stench, that their crude clothing was filthy, and that they were fit for absolutely nothing more than serving as slaves to milk their cows. This blinding, toxic arrogance played perfectly into Tokhto'a-Beki's hands. The forest chieftain fully understood. As long as the overly proud Naimans severely underestimated their enemy, they could be effectively used as a blunt battering ram. The coalition's massive army occupied the absolute highest vantage points at Mount Nahu. The Naimans and the Merkits formed an unyielding, solid wall, confidently waiting for the heavily outnumbered Mongols to crack their own skulls wide open against the unforgiving rocky slopes. Temujin found himself in a literal death trap. His army was completely exhausted, and his war horses were emaciated after unimaginably long forced marches. Launching a frontal, uphill assault against the heavily fortified positions of a well-fed and vastly superior enemy was guaranteed suicide. He urgently, desperately needed a weapon capable of piercing not physical armor, but the very minds of his enemies. He needed to inflict a paralyzing, primal, animalistic terror. As deep darkness fell, the Mongol camp suddenly sprang into coordinated action. Following Temujin's strict orders, every single one of his soldiers lit 5 separate campfires in completely different locations. When Taiyan Khan, the supreme leader of the Naimans, and Tokhto'a-Beki peered down from the towering peak of Mount Nahu, the blood instantly froze in their veins. An endless ocean of fire was blazing in the valley below. There were more roaring fires down there than there were stars in the night sky. The coalition, previously absolutely certain of the enemy's meager numbers, was suddenly gripped by the terrifying belief that the Mongol horde was infinite. Sheer panic, creeping like invisible poison gas, began to rapidly spread through the tightly packed ranks of the mountain's defenders. At the very crack of dawn, Temujin delivered the main, crushing blow. But he did not send his standard, regular cavalry into the vanguard. He unleashed his absolute most terrifying argument from its chain. An elite detachment composed of 4 legendary generals whom the steppe would forever remember as the 4 Dogs of War. You are already familiar with them from our previous episodes. There is the ferocious Jebe, whose single arrow once pierced the neck of Temujin's personal mount, and the absolute mathematical genius of war, Subutai. There is the unbreakable Jelme, the man who had desperately sucked poisoned blood from his dying master's wounds, and Kubilai, who ruthlessly enforced the ironclad law of the Yasa. Jamukha, watching the terrifying assault unfold from the enemy camp, described their relentless advance to Taian Khan using words that radiated pure, prehistoric nightmare fuel. He warned that these hounds had foreheads forged from solid bronze. Their snouts were like chisels made of steel. Their tongues were like awls, and their hearts were pure iron. He said they fed only on the morning dew, rode the raging winds, and on the bloody days of battle, they devoured human flesh. The psychological fracture of the enemy was total and absolute. Watching the detachments of Jebe and Subutai tear into the forward outposts like a starving pack of rabid wolves, Taian Khan completely lost his mind. Instead of ordering a disciplined counterattack, he commanded his massive army to retreat higher and higher up the treacherous mountain until he had driven his own forces into a deadly, suffocating crush at the very highest peak. Under the cover of night, driven entirely by blind panic, the Naiman slipped and tumbled off the sheer cliffs, crushing each other to death with such force that the sickening crunch of breaking bones sounded exactly like snapping dry twigs in a forest. The mighty Naiman Empire violently collapsed. Taian Khan was killed in the chaos. It seemed the mighty coalition had been ground into fine powder. Temujin was fully free to celebrate his monumental victory. But when dawn broke and the Mongols began meticulously counting the corpses of the rival chieftains, sure enough, one specific body was noticeably absent from the bloody pile. Tokhto'a-Beki had cheated death once again. Surrounded by tens of thousands of bloodthirsty enemies, directly in the center of a horrific meat grinder, the forest prince miraculously managed to gather a handful of his sons and the Naiman prince, Kuklug. Violently hacking a bloody corridor straight through the dense ranks of stunned Mongol soldiers, he violently ripped his way out of the mountain trap and vanished to the north, heading straight for the freezing, icy shores of the Irtysh River. Hunted to the absolute edge of the earth, permanently stripped of his army, his wealth, and all his allies, the Merkit chieftain had lost everything. But thick, hot blood still flowed through his veins, and an unquenchable burning hatred still raged in his heart. He was fully prepared to make his final, most terrifying stand deep in the heavy snows. And this violent death agony of the forest phantom would force Genghis Khan to experience a level of profound shame that not even an entire ocean of spilled blood could ever wash away.
It is the spring of 1205, the year of the ox according to the Eastern calendar. The great steppe has been left far behind. An endless, soul-crushing pursuit has dragged these sworn enemies to the absolute edge of the known world, to the brutally harsh spurs of the Altai Mountains, where the Bukhtarma River takes its rushing source to feed the freezing waters of the Irtysh. Here, on the rock-solid frozen earth, pinned tightly against a raging, boiling river, the mangled remnants of the great coalition took their final, desperate stand. The surviving Merkits of Tokhto'a-Beki and a tiny handful of remaining Naimans under Prince Kuchlug finally stopped running, simply because there was nowhere left to run. Their men were completely emaciated, their horses were dropping dead from starvation, but sheer unadulterated desperation gave them a terrifying strength, making them far more dangerous than a pack of cornered wolves. Hot on their trail, knowing absolutely no fatigue, the heavy Mongol cavalry was already pouring down from the mountain passes. Picture the grim stage for this final, bloody showdown. This is no flat, open field where you can beautifully align massive regiments in parade formation. This is a violently jagged valley, slashed by deep ravines and locked tight by late spring frosts, where iron horseshoes slip wildly on slick stones and treacherous ice. The air up here is so thin and biting cold that it physically sears your lungs with every single drawn breath. The battle erupted without any grand speeches or long preludes. Tokhto'a-Beki, a man well past his 60th year, a man who had lost his wives, his royal status, and his homeland, once again threw himself into the absolute hottest part of the meat grinder. Unlike so many monarchs of that era, who safely observed the carnage from the comfort of distant hills, the forest prince always hacked his way through the very front lines. It was as if a magical spell protected him. Over the course of a 30-year blood feud with Genghis Khan, he had miraculously crawled out of blazing camps, violently smashed through triple-layered rings of encirclement, and continually evaded the absolute best trackers in all of Asia. He was a literal phantom that cold steel simply could not bite. But every streak of luck eventually hits a brick wall. In the very chaotic climax of the brutal hand-to-hand slaughter, precisely when the Merkit lines finally began to buckle under the monolithic, crushing weight of the Mongol heavy cavalry, a sharp, piercing whistle tore through the frigid air. The ancient chronicles refer to it as a stray throwing arrow, a Shibayan sumun. The heavy, armor-piercing iron arrowhead miraculously found the one single microscopic gap in the old chieftain's armor. Tokhto'a-Beki, the legendary leader who would become a walking personal curse for the very founder of the Mongol Empire, violently plummeted from his saddle onto the blood-soaked snow. Death was instantaneous. And right here, one of the most chilling, morbidly paradoxical scenes in the entire history of medieval warfare violently unfolds. Sprinting through the thickets of the melee, desperately hacking their way toward their fallen leader, are his sons, Hudu, Gal, and Shilaun. They look down and see that their father is dead. And just a few hundred meters away, the roaring Mongol cavalry is actively smashing through their very last defensive line. Time has run out. In almost any other human culture, loyal sons would have honorably laid down their weapons to form a protective shield over their father's body, or they would have frantically tried to drag his corpse to safety. But this is the great steppe. Tokhto'a's sons know exactly what the Mongols will do if the corpse of their absolute greatest enemy falls into their eager hands. The body will be carelessly tossed beneath the iron-shod hooves of their war horses. The skull will be brutally ripped off, boiled clean, encased in silver, and transformed into a morbid drinking cup, just as they had done with other defiant Khans. Or it will be tied tightly to a horse's tail and dragged through the filth all the way back to Karakoram, grinding the honor of their entire bloodline into fine dust. The sons make a split-second decision that makes the blood of any modern person run cold, but in their brutal reality, it stands as the absolute highest act of filial devotion. The earth beneath them is frozen solid. Digging a grave to hide the body is physically impossible. And so, they draw their blades. Right there, under a relentless hail of incoming arrows, kneeling deeply in the freezing snow before the rapidly advancing enemy, the sons sever their own father's head. They snatch up this gruesome, heavily bleeding trophy, stuff it deep inside a leather saddlebag, and vault back onto their terrified horses. The decapitated, bloody torso of Tokhto'a-Beki is left alone on the frozen earth, destined to be violently trampled into the bloody mud by the armored hooves of the Mongol vanguard. To the sons, this no longer mattered. They had successfully saved their father's true face from vile desecration, perfectly preserving the ultimate vessel of his spirit. The death of the great chieftain triggered a total, cascading collapse. What had been a cohesive army just 1 minute prior instantly dissolved into a terrified mob, driven mad by sheer animal panic. The Naimans and Merkits broke and frantically sprinted toward their only possible route of escape, the Irtysh River. But the freezing spring river proved to be far more terrifying than the Mongol blades. Thousands of screaming men, weighed down with heavy iron armor and thick winter furs, sprinted out onto the fragile, cracking shore ice and threw themselves headfirst into the freezing rapids in a desperate, mad dash for the opposite bank. The ice violently splintered and gave way beneath the crushing weight of the panicked mass. Drowning men desperately dragged each other down into the dark abyss. The ancient chronicles stated with bone-chilling dryness, during the crossing of the Irtysh, they lost their greater part of their people, drowned in the river. The freezing waters of the Irtysh turned completely black that day, with thousands of floating corpses. An entire nation found its horrific, nameless grave inside that icy, raging torrent. When the thunder of battle finally died down, the Mongols systematically combed over the slaughterhouse. Among the thousands of hacked, mutilated bodies, they were furiously searching for the ultimate prize, the corpse of Tokhto'a-Beki. But when they finally located his magnificent, ornate armor, they were met with a bitter disappointment that bordered on blinding, rabid fury. It would seem the enemy was totally, utterly crushed. The great Merkit army had been slaughtered to a man or drowned. The forest prince himself was dead, his trampled, headless torso left for the scavenging crows. This absolutely should have been the final period, the perfect, bloody finale to a grueling 30-year vendetta. But for Genghis Khan, when the news was brought back to his tent, this was no victory at all. As long as the sons of his archenemy drew breath, and as long as they firmly held their father's severed head in their hands, they remained a living, breathing banner of resistance. They were a walking reminder of the exact day when the conqueror of the universe had panicked and abandoned his own wife by a broken cart. The Khan's disappointment instantly mutated into a cold, consuming, terrifying obsession. He issues an absolute decree to his best general, Subutai, an order that will forever alter the established laws of military pursuit.
An icy wind howls over the frozen banks of the Irtysh River. The air here is not filled with the scent of coming spring, but with the thick, metallic stench of freshly spilled blood. Out on the heavily trampled, crimson-stained snow, among thousands of dead warriors, Mongol soldiers are frantically prowling. They are aggressively turning over the freezing corpses, hunting for luxurious armor, violently peering into lifeless, frozen faces. Genghis Khan waits inside his grand pavilion. The conqueror of the universe eagerly anticipates the exact moment they will finally deliver the severed head of Tokhto'a-Beki, the man who had been his personal, untouchable demon for 3 long decades. A messenger fearfully steps into the ruler's tent, but his hands are completely empty.
He delivers news that makes the blood of the assembled generals freeze in their veins. Only the headless, trampled corpse of the chieftain was recovered. The sons of Tokhto'a, Hudu, Gal, and Shilan had successfully shattered the encirclement and vanished into the total unknown, carrying their father's severed head with them inside a saddlebag. Genghis Khan had genuinely, deeply believed that by utterly crushing the army on the Irtysh, he had permanently slammed the book shut on the absolute most painful chapter of his life. In harsh reality, his perfectly oiled military machine had let the most crucial element slip through its fingers, the ultimate symbol of resistance. The sheer irony of fate delivered a brutal slap to his face. The master of half the known world, the man making massive empires tremble in fear, suddenly realizes that his personal peace of mind is still being held hostage by a severed head violently bouncing inside the saddlebag of a few desperate fugitives. The raging wrath of Genghis Khan does not boil over into a blind, screaming tantrum. It instantly crystallizes into a frigid, merciless, calculated obsession. The Khan urgently summons Subutai, a young commander who is already legendary for his icy mathematical approach to slaughter. This was the very same dog of war who knew absolutely no pity and felt absolutely no exhaustion. Inside the sprawling tent, an order rings out that will forever be etched into the secret history of the Mongols. Listen closely to these terrifying words. What pulses within them is not merely grand military strategy, but a deep, primal fear aggressively mixed with the absolute power of an emperor. In my youth, I was thrice thoroughly frightened by the Merkits on Mount Burkhan Khaldun. Now these hateful people have escaped again. For this specific pursuit, I have ordered the forging of iron chariots. You must pursue them to the very end of the farthest distance, down to the deepest bottom. Even if they become marmots and burrow deep into the earth, you become the digging iron and smash them out of their holes. Even if they take flight into the sky, you become the clear-eyed falcon. Even if they dive into the ocean like swift fish, you become the giant net and drag them out. Pay extreme attention to that one specific detail: iron chariots. In a nomadic world where the sheer speed of cavalry was entirely dependent on traveling with incredibly light gear, Genghis Khan demands the creation of heavy, lumbering wagons bound in solid iron. Why? Because he remembers. He remembers exactly how the wooden axle on the cart of his servant, Hoakchin, violently snapped in a dirt rut, and because of that one failure, the Merkits were able to capture his beloved Borte. The Khan fundamentally no longer trusted wood. He demanded a transport system that absolutely would not break, not in the endless bogs of Siberia and not in the jagged, rocky gorges of the Pamirs. This hunt had to continue endlessly, relentlessly, until the very last carrier of Tokhto'a-Beki's bloodline took his final, gasping breath. Subutai catches the scent. The ultimate marathon of death begins, dragging on for years. Thousands of brutal kilometers, spanning scorched barren steppes and freezing impassable mountain ridges. Subutai relentlessly herds the mangled remnants of the Merkits straight through the lands of the Kipchaks, forcibly squeezing them further and further to the west. The final bloody act of this terrifying hunt would play out incredibly far from the Mongol steppes, on the distant banks of the Chu River. It was exactly there that Subutai's heavy iron chariots finally ran down the terrified sons of Tokhto'a-Beki. The army was permanently, completely annihilated. Hudu, Gal, and Chilan were slaughtered, and by the direct decree of Genghis Khan, uttering the very name of the Merkit tribe was strictly forbidden on pain of death. But exactly why did Genghis Khan display such an unprecedented, psychotic level of obsession? Why drain the colossal, massive resources of a booming empire just to chase down a tiny handful of starving, ragged fugitives? It was never actually about a physical military threat. A few emaciated princes with zero grazing lands and zero armies could never mount a serious challenge to the exploding Mongol superpower. The true reason was deeply rooted in profound psychological trauma. As long as a single descendant of Tokhto'a-Beki walked the earth, a living, breathing witness to Temujin's absolute deepest shame remained alive. The very moment when the future conqueror of the universe, violently trembling with fear, ran into the forest and abandoned his woman to his enemies. Tokhto'a-Beki was a walking mirror in which Genghis Khan saw not a terrifying, godlike conqueror, but a terrified little boy. And to smash that mirror forever, the Khan was fully prepared to wipe an entire civilization off the face of the planet. The Merkit men were butchered down to the absolute last individual. The tribe was meticulously dismembered, carefully chopped into pieces, and distributed as property to individual military centuries with such surgical thoroughness that the Merkits permanently vanished from the ethnic map of the world. It seemed that the grand vengeance had been executed flawlessly. But human history absolutely forgives those who try to cheat the laws of nature. In his obsessive quest to completely erase the Merkits, Genghis Khan makes a single fatal miscalculation, a mistake that births the most monumental political paradox of the 13th century. Having slaughtered the men, Genghis Khan, following ancient steppe traditions, distributed the most beautiful Merkit women to his top generals and his own sons. Among the captives taken as spoils was the widow of Hudu, the very same son of Tokhto'a-Beki, whom Subutai had relentlessly hunted down on iron chariots. This elite Merkit aristocrat was named Tokhto'a-Beki Khatun. And with a perfectly steady hand, Genghis Khan gifts this very woman to his third son, Ögedei, the future, undisputed heir to the imperial throne. Try to fully grasp the sheer magnitude of this historical irony. The man had spent 30 years violently drowning Asia in oceans of blood just to permanently scorch the Merkit seed from the earth. But by handing Tokhto'a-Beki to his own son, he had, with his own two hands, personally wheeled a Trojan horse directly into the beating heart of the Golden family. Decades would pass. Genghis Khan would die. Ögedei would drink himself to death and follow his father into the grave. And in 1242, absolute supreme power over the gigantic, sprawling empire in the history of humanity, stretching from the Yellow Sea all the way to Russia, would be violently seized by a woman, a female regent before whom powerful princes, mighty sultans, and the terrified ambassadors of the Pope would literally grovel in the dirt. That woman would be Tokhto'a-Beki, the daughter-in-law of Tokhto'a-Beki. The Merkit chieftain had lost every single one of his battles. He died with a shattered chest, and his headless torso was ground into the dirt by horses. But in the grand finale, it was precisely a woman from his burned, ruined tent who proudly sat on the throne of the exact people who had butchered her husband and annihilated her entire nation. She seized total control of the imperial treasury, violently purged Genghis Khan's old trusted ministers, and forcibly placed her own son, Guyuk, onto the throne of the world.
The Great Circle was completely closed. Tokhto'a-Beki didn't leave behind ancient manuscripts, towering stone cities, or brand legal codes. The phantom of the forest dissolved entirely into the freezing mists of the Barguzin taiga. But his chaotic life exerted an influence on the ultimate formation of the Mongol Empire that was completely on par with the legendary deeds of Genghis Khan himself. There is a profound, fundamental lesson locked deep inside this story. Tokhto'a-Beki was the exact hammer who, completely against his own desires, fiercely forged the world conqueror. If he had never come riding out of the cold night for his blood vengeance, if he had never stolen Borte away, Temujin very well might have lived out his days as an entirely unknown, insignificant local prince, quietly herding his horses on the banks of the Onan River. It was the brutal, devastating strike of Tokhto'a that violently forced the young exile to seek out massive alliances, master the deadly art of politics, and ultimately weld the great steppe into a single fist. But this dark vendetta left terrifying, unhealing scars on the very flesh of the ruling dynasty. The Merkit stain of Jochi, born just after his mother's captivity, permanently drove a wedge between the true-born sons of Genghis Khan, breeding a toxic, festering hatred that would eventually fracture the unified empire into the warring Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate. In his obsessive quest to rip Tokhto'a's people entirely out of the fabric of time, Genghis Khan ultimately achieved only one thing. The blood and genes of the Merkit tribe completely dissolved into the absolute highest ruling elite of his own mighty state. Death and total oblivion are not the same thing. You can hack off your enemy's head. You can drown his entire army in an icy river and completely crush his wooden carts beneath the weight of heavy iron chariots. But when sheer hatred becomes your only meaning in life, you unknowingly hand the keys to your own future straight to your enemy. Tokhto'a-Beki definitively proved how pride and venomous hatred can relentlessly haunt entire generations, forcing entire continents to burn. But the forest chieftain was strictly an external threat. What happens when your absolute worst, most terrifying enemy sleeps right next to you under the exact same blanket? What happens when the man who swore eternal loyalty to you, who willingly shared his blood with you, becomes the absolute only person on earth who can completely destroy your entire world? In the very next episode of the Sunset of the Steppe series, we will transition to the tragic story of Jamuka, a blood brother, a best friend, the man who personally elevated Temujin to the throne, only to later become the chief architect of the most brutal, devastating civil war in the history of the Great Steppe. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the story of the most terrifying, poetic betrayal in all of the Mongol chronicles. See you next time.